Good day, everybody, and welcome to the fourth webinar in a series of six organized by the Netherlands Enterprise Agencies. And this webinar is called The Potential of Carbon and Biodiversity Credits. This webinar will be recorded, as was announced in the program leaflet. My name is Sander van Andel, and I'm a senior expert nature conservation at IUCN
Dag schatje,
Netherlands.
lekker.
And IUCN is the largest network of organizations working in the field of nature conservation and sustainable use of natural resources. Today, I'm the moderator of this webinar and the timekeeper of this webinar with a very interesting program with speakers from Treewife, Rabobank, Kennemer Group, and Wageningen University. The goal of this webinar is to enhance and update knowledge on the potential of carbon and biodiversity credits and look at its challenges. So we invite you to introduce yourself in the chat to know who is here. We would, during the presentation, please post your questions in the chat and mute yourself at all times. Thank you for that. Other simple housekeeping rules. Please rename yourself and include your organization in your name. And again, we would really appreciate it for everybody to introduce themselves in the chat to have a lively exchange in the chat itself. This webinar was made possible by Ben Sonneveld from the Vrije University of Amsterdam, reNature, IUCN NL, and the Netherlands Enterprise Agency. And therefore, I would hereby like to invite Laura Amerlaan as for a formal brief welcome. She is a project advisor, international development. Laura.
Yes, hello everyone. A warm welcome on behalf of RVO to the fourth webinar in the series of the SDGP Knowledge Exchange webinars. In this session, we will delve deeper into the potential of carbon and biodiversity credits with very interesting speakers, Treewife, Rabobank Foundation, Wageningen University, and Kennemer, one of the SDGP projects. And we're happy to see so many of you joining online, connecting from different parts of the world. Feel free to communicate or ask questions in the chat box. Yeah, carbon and biodiversity credits are very interesting topics, but that has also been subject of debate in recent years. They hold great potential as a tool for financing climate action and incentivizing emission reductions. But there are also challenges, making it important to find ways to strengthen the integrity of carbon markets and to ensure that they contribute to meaningful global climate goals. So please note that if parties want to start ODA-funded activities in the voluntary carbon market, there is a framework that is developed by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It sets out a few principles. If you want to know more about this, you can contact me personally. I will put my email address in the chat. Yeah, thank you to the organizers from IUCN, reNature, VU Amsterdam for making this webinar possible. And of course, special thank you to our speakers who will share their valuable insights and experience with us today. We hope you find today's session inspiring and insightful. Perhaps it will give you tools and information that you can apply into your own work. So enjoy.
Thank you, Laura, for this introduction. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our next speaker, Michel Schuurman. He's Director Business Development at Treewife, with a presentation that explores the current state of the voluntary carbon markets. Michel, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks, Sander. And good day, everyone. Good to see some familiar names, but a lot of unfamiliar names. So hopefully I can contribute something to this webinar. Yeah, like Sander said, Michel Schuurman working at Treewife. Just a little bit about Treewife itself before I delve into the realm of the voluntary carbon market. We're an organization that bridges the gap between forests and finance. So on the one hand, we work with technical consultancy agencies like Face the Future and Form International, mostly Wageningen University-based experts on forestry. And on the other side, with financial markets, with two investors in Treewife itself, which is FMO and Triodos Regenerative Money Center. And lastly, we work with a lot of corporates that in the end offtake these carbon credits. And what we do is connect, in that sense, the forest project itself, the technical expertise, and the financial flow to make it possible. So just to give you a brief overview of what we do, we transform project ideas together with tropical forest owners in concrete investable projects. We make them meet the criteria on environmental, social, and governance safeguards, so they become investable and they become high integrity and high quality projects. And we then support the sales of the carbon credits or the projects themselves. We do some initial pre-funding ourselves, and then we attract the core funding. And I think it's important to mention that we are in it for a long run. We're set up as a social enterprise with a long horizon when we enter into a partnership with projects. And we're set up as a revolving structure, so any profits that we make flow back into pre-financing new projects. Now, setting the stage a bit for the voluntary carbon market was my question. It's actually based on the fact that we're currently developing about 14 projects, and we have a pipeline, as you can see in this slide, with a coverage on the global south with a focus on nature-based solutions. Now, before I get back to that and share some of our experiences, I would like to give the, well, let's say, first couple of minutes to give you an idea on what the carbon market is all about. So if I may have the next slide, if you will, Tedros, then you can see that the carbon markets in general have two main distinctions. One is compliance markets and one is the voluntary carbon market. And as you can see in the figures, and although they're a couple of years old, it just gives you a feeling that the voluntary carbon market is still a little dwarf compared to the compliance market, right? And that also gives the opportunity that if we grow the voluntary carbon market, that a lot of financial means can be made available to work on climate mitigation, but also in biodiversity enhancement and social enhancement at the same time. It's a very diffuse market when you look at the voluntary carbon market. There are about, and you can see on the next slide, about 170 plus type of projects, which go from solar panels to clean cooking stoves to optimizing industrial processes, waste disposal, landfills, what have you. We'll focus on the forestry and land use sector, which, as you can see, is quite a big chunk of it. It's about a quarter of all projects. And especially REDD+, which is about protecting existing forests, is up till today still the biggest contributor to the voluntary carbon market, at least when it comes to the number of credits. And that's not for nothing, if you will, because what you can see is that tropical forests are actually a double-edged sword, right? It is, on the one hand side, if it's being destroyed, and unfortunately it still is being destroyed, we're losing a land size, the area of the UK every year, which accounts for about 8% of the world's CO2 emissions. So if tropical forest were a country, if you will, it would be the third biggest emitter globally after some big countries that we know as to be big emitters. And at the same time, and that's the opposite side of the coin, or the other side of the sword, if you will, if we start to invest in protecting forests and we start to restore what is lost, we have a tremendous opportunity to not only get CO2 out of the atmosphere, but also contribute to fighting the decline in biodiversity and enhancing the livelihoods of about 800 million people that depend on these forests. And the absorption that the natural system can take is about 30% of what is needed globally to get to a 2050 Paris Climate Accord deal. So natural forests and natural carbon solutions, if you will, maybe including blue carbon in the oceans, is actually the biggest challenge, but also the biggest opportunity when it comes to solving the climate crisis. And for that, you need money, right? And historically, a lot of public funds has gone into that, but it needs not only more money, but it also needs more investment from the private sector because they can mobilize a lot of more capital. And well, these are some figures. It just gives you an idea that over the next couple of years, towards 2030 and definitely also towards 2040, we need to make some incremental increases and like doubling and tripling the investment. And for that, you need assets. And so forests although you could have a philosophical debate whether or not you want it or not, it should be treated as something, as an asset that is investable by itself. Strange thing, obviously, is that the tree only has financial value once it's cut down and then it's timber and then you can sell it. Right? How do we monetize and value the tree while it's still alive? That's actually what, when it comes to nature-based solutions and natural climate solutions, the voluntary carbon market's all about. Now, to give you an overview of the key actors in the voluntary carbon market, you get quite a web, as you can see here. So in the center is the project owner or developer. Could be a local community in the Amazon, could be a forestry company in Indonesia, could be an NGO with a national park in Africa. They obviously have quite some knowledge on the ground, but they have a challenge when it comes to certifying a project that meets international standards and hence becomes investable. So on the one hand side, and that's the upper left corner, you would have consultants that would do technical work to make sure the project meets that criteria. You have auditors that finally audit that work, and you have certification schemes that I'll come back on later. But an international one that's obviously quite famous is the ISO standard, if you will, in other sectors, and also the carbon markets have these kinds of standards. And then once that's on the way, you come to the lower side of this graph, and you see that there are financiers, could be grant providers, family offices, could be banks, could be pension funds, partially could be governments. And then you get to a tradable asset that either go directly to the carbon credit buyer, you see on the right-hand side, or via intermediaries like exchanges, brokers, and retailers. Now, from TreeFive's perspective, we try and work as much with buyers directly because we want the financial flows to go for the most part to the project owners in the global south. That's the ones they need it. So we try to not work with intermediaries, but they are needed to get to a scalable market for an international trade. It's an unregulated market, so that also gives a bit of a challenge when scaling it because you have quite some certification standards. As you can see here, I just came up, well, it didn't came up, I found an overview with what's been happening since it started, like way back in the 90s. And obviously, there needs to be some consolidation in the market. So what you can see on the right-hand side of this slide, if you will, Tedros, is that there are a few main standards now converging, whereas VCS, the Verified Carbon Standard, takes about 50% of the market. But there are also some important other ones like Gold Standard and Climate Action Reserve. I would also like to mention specifically Plan Vivo. That's a standard, for instance, that is focusing a lot on the social element. So yes, it is an auditable standard when it comes to the carbon element, but their focus is, all right, how do we ensure that the majority of the revenues that are generated actually flow back to the social and community elements of what's going on in the lands that the projects take place. Yeah, and there are obviously, like I said, disadvantages of an unregulated market because you get in every new emerging field some things that you don't want. And then you get criticized because there are con men or things aren't calculated as they should have been. And sometimes they are calculated as they should have been, but via the old methodologies and standards of the, let's say, 2005s. And with the knowledge of 2025, we say, well, that wasn't good enough. And that's good because everything needs to evolve, but it's sometimes a bit, how would I say, overexposed in the media saying, well, everything's wrong, right? And I really fight that stance because yes, there has been some wrongdoing, but there is also a lot of well-doing in this market. And we need not throw away the baby with the bathwater because we have no other global system that can scale and provide the finance needed to protect our forests. Now, trust is being restored. The most important one, I would say, is the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market, where a lot of actors have come together to start working on what they've called the core carbon principles and say, right, what's actually what we need. They're now measuring all the standards and the methodologies and saying, all right, well, this meets the new bar as of 2025, and this was maybe was good in 2010, but we don't want that anymore now. So there's become more clarity of what you could perceive as good. And there are some new methodologies coming up from the standards. So, for instance, Vera, the biggest one, if you will, are now launching new standards on both reforestation but also forest protection, with more guardrails and safeguards to make sure that what is promised by these projects is actually delivered. You've got new market entrants like Silvera and BeZero and Calix and others that are rating agencies that on behalf of investors and buyers also vet the project and state, wow, we think this is a AAA project or maybe a double B project. And you have, let's say, initiatives by big buyers that say, well, we would like to scrutinize the market ourselves, and one of them being Abacus, which was launched by Amazon last year, but is also being now supported by other individual companies that do specific due diligence also on land tenure, also on socio-economic elements in the country that the project is being developed. We have a new group of buyers coming to the market, which is the airline industry, which will come other compliance markets in the future, but now start working on voluntary projects as well under CORSIA, which also is new standards with specific desires and wishes. And we have, well, maybe last but not least, but maybe not even last, but more might follow, additional things coming in the market, like corresponding adjustments under Article 6, which is the UN framework that states, well, if you buy a credit for instance, let's say Kenya, and you want to also claim that in your Dutch activities, you shouldn't do double claiming. So Kenya needs to take it out of their registry, and the Netherlands could put it on their registry. That's also an important thing to get to a higher quality and integrity in the market. Now, if we add this up, and this is and the next slide is a bit of stacking, if you will. And I'm not controlling this, so Tedros, just take it step by step. But if you develop a project like we're doing, you have your own set of criteria. And like I mentioned before, we're invested by FMO, so we meet the highest IFC performance standards. Our CEO is the former CEO of FSC, the Forest Stewardship Council in the Netherlands. So if you take the next one, Tedros, you could see that we have our own set of criteria. And I'm actually, and this is not preaching for ourselves, but I'm quite convinced that we're doing the utmost to get to the best quality project. And above that, you have a next set of criteria, which is logical because those are the market standards. The core carbon principles have come up. We need to align with Article 6. Then we come up with the next one, Tedros, which is the one I mentioned, CORSIA eligibility, which is meeting Abacus, which is meeting rating agencies. And then last but not least, you have your individual buyer requirements, because some buyers say, well, we'll only buy credits from reforestation, and others will say, we'll buy credits only from the Amazon, etc. Which means if you add this up, and these are all in itself very rightful steps, it has become quite a balance to make sure that you can still develop a project that is financially viable for the communities or organizations in the land of origin, which still gives some margin for an investor to come in and make a return, and meets all the criteria as I mentioned before. So it's no easy feat to develop a carbon project. So I would say that the notion of it not being a regulated market does by no means mean that it is a cowboy market. It's actually become quite a professional and ethical market, I would say. Well, ethical, I'll leave behind. It's professional. Ethical is up to others to decide. Before I close off, I think I'm good on time. There's one thing I would like to share before handing over to the next speakers who will go more into specifics of the project. But like I mentioned in the beginning, I would also like to share some of our learnings. This is how you create a carbon asset. So how does it look like? Not on the ground, because actually then you protect forests by either getting more what we call it, guards if you're a national park, or you start working with social communities to make sure that their agroforestry that they're doing in the forest is actually in such a way that it no longer relies on cutting down new patches of forest, but becomes sustainable agriculture. Or if you're planting trees, you make sure that you do so in such a way that the people that also live in that area actually benefit through labor, through long-time employment through additional benefits, etc. But on the technical side, and that's what this graph shows, it's also a couple of years of work to get to first issuance of credits. And then obviously, if we talk about a forestation project, it still takes a couple of years for the trees to grow and hence the credits to come in. So also financially speaking, we're talking about projects that starts to generate money, if you talk about at least afforestation projects, only 6, 8, 10 years down the line and have a break-even point of 15 to 20 years down the line sometimes. So you really need to start when you start at the beginning on the left-hand side in your feasibility studies and your project design and development, right? How can we do it in such a way that it's a stepstone with a small plot potentially to have a proof of concept, then raise capital. And we're actually talking about millions in an ARR project, could literally be 20, 30 million to get to scale. And that needs to meet the bars, as I mentioned before, of all the actors involved. And I'll give you 2 examples before I close off. We're developing a project in the high Andes of Peru, which is degraded lands for tens of years. Sheep have been grazing there and taken away everything. And it's so barren that the national vegetation, what the ecosystem had, the native species, can't grow there anymore. So the only thing that we can do is come up with a non-native species, in this case pine, which can still grow, use that for the first 20 years to actually enhance the soil, then cut it down, and then come in with native species. There is a scientifically proven transformation project, if you will. But we have investors that say, well, we only invest in native species because a plantation with exotic species is not on our to-do list when it comes to investments. So this gives you an example of, all right, yes, we have criteria, but the ecology doesn't always meet what a financier in a tower wants. Another example is that we have a great nature conservation project in the Congo.
Michel, can
Yeah.
you close off?
Yeah, then I
Thank
will
you.
close off. Give me 1 minute if you will, Sander. So this is in the Congo, a great protection program. It's a hotspot of biodiversity with mountain gorillas, what have you. But because it's in the Congo, it's hard to visit from a security measure because there's a lot of unrest in the area. And investors and carbon buyers say, well, we can't do the due diligence, we can't really look at it, so we won't invest in it. So those are the challenges that you meet in practice. To summarize, and that's my last slide, if you will, Tezos. To develop a high quality project, you need to work for credible carbon certification, as I mentioned. You need to look at things like mitigation leakage. So if you start something, there are activities, where do they go to? But most importantly, I think, and those are the last 2, you need to work with benefit sharing mechanism. It is in the end all about people. Forests aren't being cut down for nothing. So it's not an environmental thing, it's a socio-economic thing. How do you address that? How do you take those people that are currently using the forest, not because they're destroyers of nature, but because they need to earn a living? How do you enclose that? And last one, we only sell to high credit buyers. So there's a lot of scrutiny on the developer market, but also make sure that credits go to organizations that first reduce their CO2 emissions. And if along the way they still need to mitigate something, that they use carbon credits. Full stop, Sander. I hope it's in the 15 minutes.
Yes, thank you, Michel. Very insightful, a lot of information for our viewers. And there's also a couple of questions coming in. Firstly, one from Caroline, and she is curious to see, you mentioned corresponding adjustments, and what is your perspective of CAs being applied in voluntary carbon markets? There seems to be some divergence of opinion, on the one hand seeing CAs as the marker of integrity, and on the other hand acknowledging that CAs risk penalizing NDC processes. How do you see that, Michel?
Yep, it's a good topic. And 2 things actually then go a bit mixed, and so I'll take them apart. One is for the voluntary carbon market, the corresponding adjustment is not needed for the majority of buyers, right? If you are I don't know, a graphical company in the Netherlands that wants to offset 200 tons of CO2, you do not necessarily need those emission reductions to be on a Dutch registry. It could still be in Uganda. You're just paying for it, right? So I think we should advance that discussion for those who would need to transfer it. It needs to be in place, but not stall a lot of developments in the meantime, because we can still do a lot. Secondly, does it hinder the NDC of the country? It might. What we see from our end is that like 98% of the countries aren't ready yet. They don't have the NDCs fully in place. They don't have the corresponding adjustments fully in place. We get signals from some, especially because we work in the global south, where governments are not that well organized sometimes. We get signals that it might take a couple of years. And yes, it still needs to develop. It needs support. I know the UN is working hard on it. But at the same time, if it will take a couple of years, our climate and our biodiversity loss doesn't have a couple of years. So also there, I suggest we keep on moving while we're talking about.
Thank you, Michel. Then for now, I leave it with that, and maybe later we come back to other questions, or you can continue in the chat. Thank you very much for your presentation, Michel. And then I would like to go to the next speaker, Max Berkelmans, assuming you're here. Hi, Max. Good morning. Good day.
Good morning. Hi, everyone.
Hi. Great that you can join. So our next speaker is Max Berkelmans at Acorn, SAF, and Rabobank, and he's an investment manager of smallholder agroforestry finance and a director of investments at Acorn, Rabobank, with a presentation that explores how to support smallholders and how they can have their own carbon projects. Very interesting subject, and thanks for joining, Max. Welcome.
Great. Thanks, Sander. Good morning, everyone, and welcome everyone from all of the sides of the world, hopefully. My name is Max. I indeed work for SAF. I never expected to be working for a bank, to be honest, but I think this topic is really interested in because I believe...
Max, excuse me, can you speak a little bit more in your mic? Then we hear you a bit better.
Is this better?
Much better. Thank you.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. My name is Max Berkelmans. I am indeed an investment manager at SAF, and today we're going to discuss how carbon credits could actually serve as a means to an end, because at SAF and Acorn, which is Rabobank's initiative of enabling smallholder farmers to transition to agroforestry and generate carbon credits, with that effort, we truly believe that carbon credits can be a really nice financing mechanism or a way for smallholder farmers to earn additional income and thereby also finance a transition towards a more sustainable system. But our goal is definitely not to generate as much carbon credits as possible. We truly see it as a good way of financing sustainability transitions. So what are we going to discuss today? First, I'm going to start quite high over with carbon markets, but I think Michel already did a good job, so I'm going to keep it really brief. So we all see that very like $1 trillion market out there, but then if you drill down on what is actually required in order to get those funding streams and revenues back to smallholders, then you see it might be quite challenging for project developers working in the field to actually benefit from this promising market. So I'm going to discuss 4 barriers that actually make it quite difficult for smallholders and especially the project developers that work with them to benefit from this potential. So that is in certification, measurement and monitoring of the carbon sequestration, access to market, and also access to finance. Then I'm going to touch a bit on carbon project life cycles, because the organizers also asked me, can you make it really tangible? What can I do if I want to start in this field? What are things I need to think about? That is pretty aligned with what Michel already just mentioned, so I'm going to keep it short there as well. Also, as being a fund, I'm going to touch a bit on what we would see as an investable project, so things that you could keep into account when developing your project. And then I'm going to end up with some project examples. So if you can go to the next slide, Sander, then... So if we look at the voluntary carbon market, and I think everybody is talking about it for years already, we see a lot of promise, right? There's a lot of potential, and that's mostly based on an increasing number of corporates that, next to reducing their carbon emissions, also want to compensate their carbon emissions. So the number of companies that are doing so are increasing, by which also the demand for carbon credits is increasing rapidly. So currently the market is faced with the shortfall of supply of high quality carbon credits, by which also we expect prices to go up, right? So with a growing demand and prices going up, there's a lot of potential for a lot of funding, private finance to be channeled to where I believe it's needed most, emerging markets, smallholder communities, where that funding is really necessary. But then, yeah, it's still quite tricky in order to tap into that potential, right? And if you look at the number of carbon projects working with smallholders on the ground, you see that number is actually quite limited so far. So if you can go to the next slide, Sander. And that is because there are a lot of barriers that make it difficult for project developers in order to tap into that potential. And I'm going to list them all separately and then also touch briefly upon how the propositions of Acorn and SOF ensure that these barriers can be overcome. So if you're a project developer, where to start, right? I'm going to start with certification. That is oftentimes quite tricky to get because it requires a lot of technical expertise. It requires a lot of time in order to fill out all the paperwork, and it also requires a lot of money in order to pass each step of the certification cycle. So for example, if you want to fill out a project design document, that might already be an upfront cost, which is oftentimes quite hard for project developers that work with smallholders to come up with. So what Acorn there did is collaborate with the Plan Vivo Foundation and really do a lot of hand-holding with the local partners in order to ensure that in each step of the process, of the certification process, they are supported with the paperwork and a team. And also none of the costs of the certification cycle has to be borne upfront by those project developers. So that's one thing. The second thing is you need to have a very good way of actually measuring, but also then monitoring your approach towards carbon sequestration. So in my head, sometimes it sounds pretty straightforward, right? You plant trees or you restore nature, and then based on the carbon that is sequestered, you can generate carbon credits. But actually, if you want to have certified credits, then you have to really have a robust mechanism towards how do you actually account for that? How do you measure? How do you ensure that the trees are still there in a couple of years from now? And that oftentimes also requires the project developers to go into the field each year to count all of the trees, to measure the height of the trees. And yeah, you can imagine that is quite time consuming and also very costly. So what Acorn did is to do that actually based on remote sensing technology. So based on satellite images, Acorn can see the growth of the trees on a yearly basis happening on the individual plots of the smallholder farmers. So that is quite accurate in terms of the predictions and also quite cost efficient compared to yearly site visits. That is a second barrier that is oftentimes hard for project developers, especially working with smallholders because there's so many plots of them. Then a third barrier is access to market. So how is a cooperative in Uganda, I just name an example, are going to sell the credits to a big tech company from the US, let's say Microsoft, a client to which we are selling a lot of credits. That is quite hard, right? And being a bank, we have a lot of corporate clients, so we can make that, if we do the sales on behalf of the project developers to those big corporates, we can make that easier for them. And I think that is a nice part of the proposition, and also general, what is hard in the carbon market is that there are so many players out there that are required for a lot of the different aspects of the proposition, which all take their cut, right? If you have somebody that is trading the credits, if somebody's certifying the credits, if somebody is auditing the credits or brokering the credits, that is a lot of entities that all want to take their share. And by cutting out all of these middlemen, I think Acorn has been able to transfer a lot of the benefits of the carbon revenues back to the smallholders. Because if you see what happens in practice, is that very few of those benefits are flowing back to the smallholder communities. And I think because they are taking the most risk, they should also be rewarded most. The last barrier is finance. If you look at the life cycle for projects, there's a lot of funding needed at the beginning of a project. So when trees need to be planted, when farmers need to be trained, when the project has to be set up. But obviously nature takes time. So if you plant the trees, then the revenues only come in after a couple of years. And the funding piece is also something that the market could improve upon. Whereby then also in a lot of instances I've seen not a lot of the funding flows back to the smallholder farmers. So Sander, if you can go to the next slide. This is just an overview of all of the entities that are involved. So in the Acorn proposition, the smaller farmers plant trees on their land. Then the local partner, which is the organization that we work with, they those are oftentimes SMEs, NGOs, or cooperatives of farmers. They collect the data of all of the farmers that participate in our project, and they do everything to ensure that the smaller farmers that we work with can plant trees and transition to agroforestry on their land. Then what we do at Acorn and SOF, the biomass is being measured by the remote sensing models that I mentioned, and the carbon removal units, or CRUs, are being generated and then also sold to buyers that want to offset their emissions. So in our case, Microsoft, Standard Chartered, Lavazza. Then Acorn ensures that also the credits are registered on our platform, and that also the payments are being transferred back to the local partner, and then the local partners are also the responsible ones to pay out to farmers. So the farmers, based on the 70% of the income they are entitled to in our proposition, can earn an additional income stream based on the carbon revenues. Next slide, please. Going to be very brief on this. Acorn is open to work in a lot of countries where there are large populations of smaller farmers. Most important criteria is that there are not any restrictive legislation happening in the country which impedes the sales of carbon credits on the voluntary market, and the presence of capable local partners that can set up an agroforestry project with smallholders at scale. And therefore, quite naturally, we're mostly in Latin America, Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa. Next slide, please. Going to be brief on funding, which is actually SOF, the organization I work at. So when I started working at Acorn, we didn't have a structural funding solution for the Acorn projects, which is also quite hard, right? Most of the projects are funded by donors or by very commercial entities that basically want to have a cheap access to credits, basically to offset their emissions. So we work with a couple of commercial and also impact financiers. We pool that capital and distribute it to the local partners that we work with, so they can purchase all of the in-kind provisions that the smallholder farmers need in order to transition to agroforestry. So think of seedlings, think of fertilizer, think of trainings in order to how to plant the trees and intercrop them with their main crops. And that is then being repaid by a percentage of their future carbon income. And this is what I actually like most of our proposition. If you see the funding mechanisms that are available to smallholder farmers in emerging markets, that is quite limited, right? It might be that there are microcredit schemes, there might be some donor funding, but it's actually quite limited, especially for long-term sustainability transitions. And I think in this way, a carbon project and the additional revenues from the carbon can be a nice way for smallholders to indirectly refinance their transition to an agroforestry system, not by an out-of-pocket expense. So in our proposition, they don't have to pay for any of the in-kind provisions up front, but it is being deducted from their future carbon income. Next slide, please. This is a very high-over example on how that would work. So imagine a farmer wants to transition to agroforestry, and he or she receives 150 euros as an aggregated value of the in-kind provisions at the start. Then that loan is being provided to the smallholder farmer via the local partner that we work with, and then the trees are planted. If all goes well, and this is again a fictional example, then you see that in year 1, in year 3, the smallholder farmer generates the first carbon credit. So in the first 2 years, there's nothing. And then from then onwards, there's a yearly carbon credit based on the biomass growth of the trees. Then Acorn sells a carbon removal unit for 40 euros. And then we say we use 40% of that in order to repay the loan that the smallholder farmer gets at the beginning. So then you see that after a period of 8 years, in this case, that the smallholder farmer has repaid the 150 euros. This example doesn't include interest, but then after that loan repayment, the smallholder farmer gets the full revenues again. So they have an additional income stream on a yearly basis to also be incentivized for the work that they're doing in terms of maintaining the trees and being part of a project. Next slide, please.
Max, can you slowly round off? Thank you.
Yes, I think I'm going to skip this slide then, because Michel also touched upon it, and just wanted to end with what would we think of what are our criteria for an investable project. So if you're developing a carbon project and you would like to receive funding at one point in time, I think these aspects are nice to take into consideration. So I think most of all, we're looking for capable local partners with experience in agroforestry and in the implementation of a project, and also most importantly, that has the relationship with smallholder farmers, receives trust from all of the participants, and is also able to engage with important stakeholders such as underlying cooperatives or governments that are governments of that country. We also require certain skills. So in certain areas, we have a requirement of a minimum of 5,000 farmers in the project. There needs to be contract with participants, and also, as Michel mentioned, adequate community benefit sharing mechanisms, because it's important to keep them incentivized and that they see most of the value of the project. Then as last two, so as I mentioned, measuring, monitoring, certification is important. So you really have to have a robust mechanism on how do you ensure to measure the biomass growth and the carbon sequestration. That always needs to be via a certified methodology, because that is what buyers want, right? They're not going to buy a credit that is not certified. So that is very important. And yeah, a very important thing is also you need to have access to markets. So, and we see the market moving more towards long-term offtake agreement. I think that's a nice thing, because then indeed you as a project developer are ensured that you're going to sell your credits against a certain price, and also financiers oftentimes want that because the voluntary market, carbon market, is still deemed to be quite volatile. That was it. Quite a lot of information, but open to questions if they're there.
Thank you, Max. Very insightful presentation. And indeed, there are a couple of questions in the chat. One is your view on how do carbon and biodiversity credits differ from previous past mechanisms? And how can, for example, your program also enhance ecosystem services? And are you measuring that? Or what's your view on the relationship with the carbon and the ecosystem at the landscape level? Thank you.
Yeah, good question. I think with regards to ecosystem services or biodiversity credits, and in that regard, I think for now, carbon credits are the most easy or most tangible way in order to monetize or measure ecosystem services, right? So we see ourselves as a player that is able to, when there is a market for it, in order to ensure that we lift the barriers for project developers. So we're not really active in further developing the market for ecosystem services. With regards to biodiversity credits, we're looking if we could incorporate that, because I think there are mainly two strategies for that, right? You can either say carbon credits with a lot of nature-based carbon credits already have a lot of biodiversity benefits. In our case, agroforestry has a lot of them. So you could say, well, we need to higher the price because there are also biodiversity components of the project. Or you could say we're going to separately also issue biodiversity credits. That is not something we are focused on at this moment in time.
Okay, yeah, clear. But you're looking towards it a little bit, I see.
Yes.
And another question was, has SAF been affected by the recent pooling of US aid funds and the ODA cuts at Dutch level? And does that risk in some way your also the model and the support of that program?
Yeah, very good question. Also, a question I got a lot these recent weeks. Yeah, we think it's horrible what's happening at USA, to be honest. But we have been so lucky of already having received the grant last year, so it's already on our bank account, and we don't have to pay it back, fortunately. But I think you touched upon a very interesting point that I think donor funding will dry up more in the upcoming years. Also, unfortunately, if you look at, for example, the Netherlands, they have significantly reduced their budgets. Well, the US then as well. And I'm afraid that this trend might continue in other countries. So I think that's why these more market-based mechanisms with carbon credits, or hopefully other types of payment for ecosystem services credits in the future, might be a good replacement for the donor funding. And I still think we will need to have donor funding for some aspects of projects that are not financeable by private funding. But hopefully, if we can design carbon projects well, we can also ensure that still a lot of funding is flowing towards where it's most needed. So that it might be a good moment in time also to have more of these models there.
Great, thank you, Max. There are a couple more questions in the chat, so maybe you can answer them there still. For now, I would like to thank you a lot for your presentation, and maybe later we get back to the panel discussion at the end of the program. Thanks a lot.
Very good. Thank you, Sander.
And then I would like to introduce our next speaker, which is Simon Bakker. He is the founder and CEO of Kennemer Group, with a presentation that explores how to align climate finance with the core business practices, the challenges faced, and also the opportunities in the evolving carbon market. Simon, I would like to invite you to take the floor, and thanks for presenting your insights.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me. My name is Simon Baker. Based in the Philippines. I am now calling you from Mindanao. Maybe something you can go to the next slide. And about 15 years ago or so, started Kennemer in Mindanao, focused really on agriculture supply chain from smallholder farmers. And so what I want to tell you a little bit about is how we ended up kind of working in the carbon space, and why, and also how that's going, because we've been at it now for a few years. So I've kind of started this business originally really with the vision in mind of working with smallholder farmers, trying to increase kind of income from it. It was originally much more of a social enterprise. It became much more social and environmental kind of KPIs or impact over time. The Philippines is not a huge supplier of cacao. We quite quickly went into a kind of a grower program. So we work with about 20,000 farmers, and the vision was to say, how do we increase both the number of farmers and, of course, the yield per hectare. Over the years, we kind of if you work in smaller farming systems, you are always a problem solver, so to say. So one of the first things we worked on is financing. So we started what is now really a microfinance organization focused on rural communities, and that helps a little bit, but it really, you cannot do everything with debt. And so we ended up for training, community management services, relying a lot on grants, which worked fine for a while, but it's really quite cumbersome. And as has already been mentioned in today's call, this is kind of a source of funding that is going to become less and less. But of course, at the time, that wasn't the case, but it just became so hard. So we had planted a number of trees, cacao trees, and we figured maybe we can carbonize them. And so that was 2018, 19. We've set up our own team. We ended up kind of developing a whole carbon development, a carbon developer. And so we have now really 3 companies in our group. We have Kennemer, the agri company. Besides cacao, we are also working in the banana value chain, so banana cacao mostly. We have a microfinance organization, Agronomica. We work with about 15,000 smallholder farmers there. And Kennemer Eco, which is a carbon developer. We are the first and only ARR Vera certified and issuing project in the Philippines so far, and busy with some other projects right now. Maybe next slide. So kind of the way we kind of see the world and how it's kind of evolved over the years. This is, in a way, the carbon side has been the last 5, 6 years. The whole business, Agronomica, we started about 8 years ago, is that the role of our carbon development really is to bring in funding, sustainable funding into communities, to help kind of create agroforestry systems that can help doing exactly the things that we wanted to do anyway. And so it kind of helps the funding of the communities, what they want, and the type of funding that we want to spend money on. What we learned, of course, is that agroforestry, to be totally honest, is not a great sequester of carbon. You really need more forestry than the ag. Cacao, coffee, all these trees are really small sequesters. And so quite quickly, we moved from our very kind of crop-based model to a much more heavier forestry model, and doing also proportionally a lot more reforestation. And we also ended up actually and we are, in the final stages of validation of a RED Plus project. We, of about 150,000 hectare forest that we're protecting, because a lot of the activities related to reforestation and protection are the same. And if you really want to get funding, into these communities, purely, the agroforestry is just too small. And you saw that a little bit in the earlier example also. They're nice, it's nice funding, but to make meaningful impact on a per hectare basis, you really need a larger funding on a per community, per farmer basis. And so you in a way do that by combining RED Plus activities on conservation and also having more forestry elements in your Ag4, So your agroforestry has your agri component as a percentage of total trees planted is smaller. So with us, that combines with our foundation, which we set up to really work on community management, agronomica, and you can see here also in the slide, Kennemer Foods, which besides kind of a grower program, we also manage our own farms to, kind of walk the talk, to be sure that we know what we're talking about. So that's a little bit kind of the value chain as we have it. Maybe if you go to the next slide. So that really has kind of, where we are a landscape organization in a way by evolution, right? It's kind of how we started. We work in Philippines, mostly in the southern island of Mindanao, conservation with indigenous people. Most indigenous people and live kind of in the uplands in a large kind of ancestral domain concessions. Buffer zones really has become reforestation, and as you go lower down the kind of the mountain almost, you get more into a pure agroforestry systems. The lowlands we invest and we also manage our farms, which the impact there is much more of kind of a social, providing steady employment at good income levels with a good social package for employees. But you can kind of see how it kind of evolves from a kind of solution perspective as you go through the landscape. That is, what we're doing now. We have kind of this in place, right? We have started our RED Plus in 2022. Similar to what Michelle earlier saw, that kind of development pipeline, it really does take 3 to 4 years. So you really need to be able to raise sufficient funds to start a project and kind of work through that whole validation and verification process. So that has been a challenge. The other challenge I think it's worth highlighting, especially on also for the reforestation, it really is the timelines you see for the different steps. They really they can easily get delayed. And so cash flow wise, it really is a challenge how to build, kind of enough robustness there that you can continue your program. So I think, for a pure carbon developer, it is very hard to run a project like this. And I think really, you really need multiple streams of income where the carbon really is a supplementary income rather than the sole source. So that will be my first kind of piece of advice or a learning. The other thing I think carbon projects, and maybe that's interesting about Acorn, but if you do yourself a project, let's say under Vera, you're extremely dependent on Vera's capacity and timing. So going back to the timing issue. But the other thing is that the skills you need to bring are quite significant. So as an organization, you need your GHG accounting, you need to really understand kind of that whole verification certification process, your GIS teams. So for us, it's become quite an investment over time. Now we have these teams, we do it ourselves. We don't rely a lot on external firms or consultants. And you realize this is really a barrier for smaller farmer cooperatives or organizations to participate. And so one of the kind of strategic thrusts that we have right now also is to kind of, you realize rather than developing your own projects, you need to become a partner for other organizations that I just don't see how they can easily get to the point where they can develop their own project. So it's much easier if you partner, so the barriers to entry are quite significant. And I think what we're going to see is a few high quality, high integrity carbon developers that work with livelihood and kind of high transparency on benefit sharing, and then work with kind of many national, subnational, or kind of like farmer organizations in order to give them access. And so this is a little bit how I see it develop, kind of evolving, where the industry is maturing, but it is quite complex to enter, and you need sufficient resources, and you need quite a holistic model to pull it off. That is really the points I wanted to make, and I think I'm a bit early, but I think that's fine.
Thank you, Simon. No, that's very interesting to get this example from a landscape perspective, and I'm very interested in what you said about the whole mix of types of carbon credits, the agroforestry, the conservation, and indeed there are also a couple of questions in the chat. One question was, what is included in the initial investments to agroforestry transition? Are there only on-farm investment, or do they also include cost by local partners with the risk of diminishing the net CRU money for farmers?
Well, the system implementation is the vast majority of the cost, right? So this is really planting material. Um, and agroforestry, the point here is, of course, most smallholder, especially in Southeast Asia, most smallholder farms are kind of full already. So it's not that you have a heck of a lot of space to plant a bunch of forest trees. And farmers really would like to have productive trees. So productive trees are fruit trees. Their planting material is a lot more expensive. And if you need some kind of good native species to sequester carbon, you're going to be, looking at kind of a broader landscape. So you're going to need to work also with the investments you need to do outside the system are around, field technicians that kind of guide communities on training, where to find it, registering the land, monitoring it. So I think I would say 80% of the cost is field kind of system implementation. 20% you need to budget for your kind of the management team that handles these communities.
So initially, not much is going to the smallholder farmer as an initial investment to change the practices on his farm, basically, or it's more supporting
Think
him.
about it. If you think about the for the communities, the benefit really what they're that $100 per hectare or whatever it is interesting, but it doesn't really move the needle.
No.
But 500 cacao trees or coffee trees that are now productive and their skill has been developed, that can generate significant income. So the benefit sharing to a large degree is that whole additional income opportunity that you get early on. Now, of course, many of these trees have a long gestation period, so it will take a couple of years to get there, and you need to keep the momentum with these communities with regular visits and training. But that really is, I think, the heart of the benefit. And then there will be some additional funding in the out years where you can use for some training or for some inputs or for some tools and other things to kind of complement it. But I think you need to really look at what is moving the needle for these communities in terms of benefit.
Thanks, Simon. And then there was another a bit more landscape related question, and you reflected on that. The question was, given that agricultural expansion is a primary driver of forest degradation, how can carbon credit mechanisms be designed to effectively incentivize both increased agricultural productivity and robust forest conservation? Do you have any reflection on that?
Well, I mean, what is really so at the smallholder level, in my experience, what we see a lot is the it's really kind of maize or corn, kind of these type of crops. So, what you have is the very prime land is already taken. So now you have smallholder farmers that live on marginal agricultural land, meaning quite steep, maybe shallow topsoil. And they, because of they're in a subsistence form, they cut the trees to plant not a tree, but they plant short, just rotating crops. For example, like typically is corn, and that kind of in one season the topsoil washes away. So those are that is a huge driver in our area. What you need to do, of course, is to with carbon credits is you can work on say, well, we can work with you, but you need to change the 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 sources of your income to more sustainable sources. And but you have, of course, the challenge is that you go from 3-month crops to a crop that takes 3-4 years before they generate income. And you cannot really totally replace that with carbon credits. You're going to need to think of some other ways and some other interim crops to design a system. But it really that whole process of getting people into more sustainable livelihood systems, payment for ecosystem services, biodiversity credits, carbon credits are a fantastic additional source. It's just, not super easy to access.
No.
That's the
And
only problem.
and does that also, did you, for example, make together with other stakeholders a landscape plan on which areas to actually conserve and
Yeah.
get the red credits? So I think a lot of listeners are very interested in the mix of carbon and different finance sources that you have been able to enter
Yeah,
into the landscape.
I mean, what you really, and so this is, I mean, this is kind of the journey working in these systems is
Yeah.
that you need to become an expert on a whole bunch of different things. And one of them is landscape planning and community management. So community management works at the village level, but you need to replicate that now at kind of the larger provincial or depending on your legal structure, because you need kind of the mayor and other people to kind of buy into the communal decisions around what areas are for preservation or for watershed areas and what areas are for productive. So you need to do that element as well to be sure that you're not planting crops that later will be or trees that later will be cut. So the way to do it is to do that planning, to look at where the trends of deforestation are, where the communities live in the buffer zones, and to start working around that. You know what I mean? And if you have a forest to protect, fantastic, right? Then you have an asset to protect as well. Sometimes the forest is just too little to protect that it's not maybe not worth it to do a whole red project. But if you have, I think it generates a lot more credits early on, and then kind of the ARR credits kind of come over time. And a lot of the things you need to do in an ARR and a Red Plus are the same. You still need to do stakeholder management. You still need to do kind of all this the community management that you need to do are the same. You just some of the initiatives that in fact, even a lot of the projects that you do are even the same because reforestation and livelihood protection is also livelihood creation is also a great way to preserve a forest. Not just reforesting is a great way to conserve.
Yeah. Thank you, Simon. I think that's very interesting. Would love to talk more about it. But for now, I want to thank you a lot for your presentation and your questions. There are a couple more in the chat as well, and there's a lively discussion going on. So please, yeah, support that chat as well. And thanks again for the effort of your presentation. Then I would like to go to the next speaker, which is Hinke Wiersma. She's a researcher at Wageningen University, and she has a presentation specifically aimed at biodiversity credits. Hinke, very welcome and take it away.
Yes, thank you for inviting me. My name is Hinke Wiersma. Well, I'm from Wageningen Environmental Research, the team Sustainable Forest Ecosystems. So my colleagues and I were asked by the Dutch government to explore the concept of biodiversity credits. In that sense, I would like to give you an overview of the current state of affairs. So we can go to the next slide. So it is a bit of like, yeah, what's happening. There's a lot going on. Of course, we had the COP last year, and well, there's like, yeah, it's saying like it's happening in the shadow of carbon credits chaos. So there's a lot of opinions about it. So we can go to the next. And we can go a bit faster through this. I put just a few of what's happening out there. So biodiversity credits cannot work, but also like koala credits, investors put price tags on biodiversity. But of course, there's also like more positive notions. I think that's the next one. Yeah. So there's already in Colombia, there's a voluntary biodiversity credit methodology, which is already certified. I will go into that later at the examples, but also people see opportunities to create a new financing framework. But also there's a lot, like the last one, there's also a lot of like uncertainties, like should you keep it local or things about scalability. So next, we will go into all of that in the presentation. So I will share a bit on definitions that are out there, what's the relevance of biodiversity credits, a bit about upcoming institutional setting developments around that, and of course what are opportunities, but also the challenges. Then I hope to share a few examples if the time allows it, and then I will give a summary at the end. So next slide, please. I hope this is the only slide with this much text in it. So it's a bit about, there's very different definitions out there now. First is like in units intended to finance measurable gains in biodiversity through conservation or restoration. And then also pollination, they added like, and which is not used to offset an equivalent negative impact. So there's also like some say offsetting is also part of biodiversity credits, but some see it as a separate thing. And well, there's a lot of discussion about that as well. Then also people call it like more like a certificate. Then you see that the WWF also really like, they really state what kind of activities are involved, like nature restoration, conservation, or stewardship activities. And then like, we already talked, the other presentations also talked about Plan Vivo. So they already have offer certificates on restoration of degraded ecosystems and also the conservation of areas with globally significant biodiversity. So that's just to show you a little bit of what's out there with discussions are taking place. And then the relevance, the need for credits. Well, I think the carbon credits presentation, they also already talked about financing gap and all that. So on the left, you see the biodiversity conservation financing in 2019. And then on the right, you see what will be needed by 2030 to reach the goals. And that there's like a huge financing gap. And then only part of that can be covered by like subsidies and like that. So there, in that sense, there's also huge potential for the private sector, and in that case, biodiversity credit. Next. So in that sense, biodiversity credits could be a way to transparently and credibly show the impacts of nature positive investments. Then next slide, please. So then a bit more on use cases and demand drivers. So there's like more internal drivers, so their organizational values. Some are really have the intention to work on biodiversity and on nature, so that can drive the demand for biodiversity credits. But also, as we already heard in one of the questions, like ecosystem services, payments for access to raw materials is also a way, of course, to pay for nature outcomes, so to say. Then you also have more like external factors like regulatory. There's like a lot of companies who also want to get ahead of like policy development and already invest in nature. For example, also like reputational, like consumers could pay, if they pay for a project, they could pay like a premium for biodiversity. In that sense, already help to conserve or work on biodiversity. So that's more about the willingness to pay, which of course also applies to companies. Then on the other hand, there's like different use cases. So one is like, yeah, we already was one question about that. So about enhancing carbon credits for better nature outcomes. This is also in the sense that for sometimes also carbon credits could even have a negative impact on nature. So to have this biodiversity premium, for example, that could even help to enhance carbon credits for better nature outcomes. But of course, they can also be, like what was said before, how should I say that? Issued separately. Then the second one is this access to ecosystem services, as I already said. And the third case is more about contribution to nature recovery beyond your own impact. So it's actually really making a contribution towards this global biodiversity framework goals that were set. You also have use case 4, which is offer products bonded with nature recovery. I think I already mentioned that as well. And then the fifth use case, a bit contested use case, is by taking responsibility for and mitigate biodiversity impacts, which is a bit more about offsetting. And that one, there's a lot of discussion ongoing because it's like, yeah, how like fungibility of biodiversity, like how do you compare the company's impact with restoring nature somewhere else? Is that comparable? But I will also get back to that in more of the challenges and opportunities that are there. So I think we can go to the next slide. This is a bit more about the market, or it's not based on projection, but it is just 3 possible scenarios. Like the first one, the limited development, is based on historical precedent. So it's about what is happening currently in the last few years, and based on that, it will reach 6 billion in 2050. Then the effective development is actually based on the parallels from the voluntary carbon market. So in that sense, we could reach 69 billion in 2050. And the last one is really based on if companies really commit to these global biodiversity framework goals, if we start valuing nature more, I would say, then it can have a huge potential. So that's just a bit on that. Then the next slide. A bit on the institutional setting. Like there's a lot of happening now. There's a lot of what works, what doesn't work. There's a lot of pilots, a lot of initiatives. I just put a few here on the right, and big, like the Biodiversity Credit Alliance and the International Advisory Panel on Biodiversity Credits. There's a lot happening about setting standards, but also knowledge and practice sharing hubs, having examples, seeing what works. And of course, there's a lot of discussion also going on about like what should be the duration of a contract, which flexibility is built in, but also like completeness. Should you take into account natural disasters, for example? So of course, there's a lot more about that. And then the next slide is just to show a little bit. I like this picture a lot. It shows us a bit of how much is going on actually. So not really going into it, but just to show you like everything, but that's happening right now. And then I would like to share a bit more on the opportunities. Yes. So what it could actually do is it could have increased investment in conservation, also with this filling this financing gap. But also beyond conservation, like also the idea is that we'll have also social returns, or it will have it will be positive for local communities. But of course, that's also already a challenge as well, like how to do that and how you make sure it's done well. It promotes the no net loss goal by mitigating this negative impact, and hopefully it will also create additionality, so have this contribution to more net positive gains. But also a very important thing is I think that it boosts awareness. It can really create more awareness about biodiversity loss, but also about bending the curve and looking towards biodiversity gain. And it can also improve land management, like landowners can really also invest in biodiversity activities. Then, of course, there are also challenges. I think I would say big challenges. We can go to the next slide. Yeah, so for example, metrics. How do you measure biodiversity? Can you compare, like for example, you see the grutto, the Dutch national bird. Can you compare that to a tiger? You know, and also the scalability. Should you keep it on local scale, or should you be able to work on more international scale? Also, double counting. I think we already heard that a little bit. So with carbon credits, biodiversity credits. And yeah, in that sense, so should we allow both biodiversity offsets and credits, or only credits? Should it have this net positive gain, or is offsetting also an option? And how do we then regulate that or go about that? Also, at the moment, you see it's mostly focused on restoration and conservation projects. So there's not much on, like, for example, farmlands where farmers want to also invest in biodiversity and how that would work. And of course, like I already said, with the opportunities, the social equity concerns, so it should be, of course, well, how do you say that? Established. And yeah, that would mean, for me, I would go to these three main, how do you say that? Words like integrity, credibility, and transparency, they should be high. And I think that's a really challenge to get there. So in that sense, a set of common principles, standards, and methods is needed. Then now I would like to share some examples that I found. So the first one is in Colombia. I think Colombia was also one of the first countries to really work on biodiversity credits.
Hinke, you have 3 minutes left for your presentation.
Oh, thanks. That will work. So this was mainly by Terrazos. They established habitat banks. This one is 240 hectares. They decided it should have a positive contribution to nature, like preservation and restoration. They have 310,000 potential credits, of which 62,000 are now available. And one credit, they choose the metric of one credit is for 10 square meters, and they choose a time period of 30 years. And I think they measure it with indicator species. So I'm not sure about that, but I thought that was how they measure it. Then the next example is also from Colombia. Called Sabimbo is the first certified standard, which you also saw at the beginning in the media overview. So they use actually a different, they use an area of 1 hectare, so different from the previous, for a fixed time of 1 month. So they made a whole formula that you see on the right. And then they have an integrity scale from 0 to 1. And then, they have this value metric, like the values, the planet-wide value of preserving the ecosystem where the unit is located. Of course, all ecosystems are different, so some have more biodiversity value or nature value than others. And for them, full integrity is an ecosystem with every ecological niche available to and filled by native species. You can read a lot more on what they are doing on their website. They really have a lot of, they explain a lot on how they define all these things like area and time, etc. So I think that's interesting to look at more if you are interested in that. Then the next slide. So this is a bit of an overview of what's emerging projects in Africa on biodiversity credits. I just thought it's nice to see what's happening there, but we're not going into this specifically. Then the next slide, I just want to show one other example. This one is specifically on high integrity tropical forests. So it's not for any kind of ecosystem, but they specifically focus on tropical forests. This one is in the Republic of Congo, and it's organized by the Wildlife Conservation Society. For them, a unit is 1 hectare of healthy, high integrity tropical forest, actively conserved within a large landscape for decades. And then we go to the next slide, I have some more details on it. So there's like 3 pillars they're looking at: biodiversity conservation, sustainable forest resource management, and participation of local communities. And for them, like they're more focusing on a wholesome system. Like at the beginning, 80% must be high integrity, and also during monitoring periods. So it's not so it's more issue based on maintenance. So they don't look at like performance against a baseline. And also there's no additionality required in the scheme. So that was a bit of like, well, different examples that are out there. Then I'm coming to a summary. It's on the next slide. Yes, so actually it's a nascent concept and market. There's a lot of things developing, like I said, looking into what works and what doesn't work. There's like these different demand drivers and also use cases. Then the institutional setting is really developing. There's a lot of initiatives going on in order to set standards and look what's working, what doesn't. And I think it has a great like potential. There's big opportunities in order, to fill this financing gap, to boost awareness. But on the other hand, there's also major challenges which still should be overcome. And I would then end with these three keywords like high integrity, credibility, and transparency, which are very important. And then for that, a set of common principles, standards, and methods is needed. And with that, I would like to end my presentation.
Thank you, Hinke, for this presentation, for yet another level how we want to invest all in our planet. For the time sake, I would like to basically go to the next level, which is basically a very short panel discussion, which I would like to ask one question to all speakers, including you, Hinke, and maybe you can start also with that. But then I would also like to hear the view of the other speakers as well. How do you see the current demand signals for separate biodiversity credit markets, and to what extent can basically carbon credits and biodiversity credits be merged? So really, to that biodiversity credits will even have a nature positive effect, or are they separate still? Thank you for your reflection.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question. I heard that most of the carbon credits they already have. Also, they need to have co-benefits for nature already. So I think in that sense, um, it can be tricky. So yeah, there also comes a double counting issue that I mentioned. But I think, like I also said, there's also the other hand where I think it can also really, be beneficial to have this enhancement of this biodiversity credits, also making sure that, for example, sometimes carbon credits could also really have this negative impact on nature if you just focus on that. So in that sense, I think it could really help each other. And then I find it hard actually to say whether you should keep them, work best. I think it both can exist. I think also having them separate can also work. So yeah, I'm also curious what others think of that.
Yeah, thanks, Hinke. Maybe Simon, how do you see that merging of those two ideas, and is it always possible, or are they also competing in some cases?
I have a very practical example. I'm actually we have started actually. We're signing an agreement tomorrow with communities that, so within the Vera you have your VCS and you have your CCB, right? And so we have a set of buyers. These are corporates that buy on the basis of CCB um, um, only. So there's no carbon element to it. So they're, kind of in a way biodiversity credits. And we have ended up with a per hectare dollar fee. And in that agreement, we still have the possibility of converting it into a VCS CCB, with the carbon element to it. But given that a lot of the benefit that we can give the communities are already within the CCB credits, because the buyers we are working with are mostly palm oil users, and this comes from an requirement, kind of their corporate requirement. So these are, large known firms to all of us, and they see the CCB credit as a way to kind of compensate for past palm oil purchases which have caused deforestation. For us, what we like it's de-risking a little bit this because all our other projects are carbon, and if you don't realize your reduction in deforestation, you have like no revenue. So this is totally unrelated to carbon. We can move it to carbon, but since a lot of the value that we can generate is already paid through the CCB certificates, the incremental at this stage of pricing of RED Plus, the incremental value is not that much. So we actually I would prefer to stay within the CCB.
Okay, thank
So,
you. I
so
will. Thanks for that view, Simon. And Max, how do you see that?
Yes, thanks, Sander. Yeah, I have to be honest, I quickly chatted a bit with the sales department of Acor to validate like what is happening on the demand side. And it is
Yeah.
quite aligned with my expectation as well that I think corporates for now are still mostly focused on indeed like offsetting their emissions. And because carbon is easier to monetize, I believe that their main focus is on that. And also, well, that was validated that we don't really hear corporates talk about biodiversity credits or like as a direct necessity on the short term. So then I think including more biodiversity elements ensure that the carbon credits are high integrity is then important, right? And that is actually that we see with corporates a lot that they're willing to pay quite high prices if indeed a lot of community benefits or other elements, co-benefits are added to the project. So that is my take on it.
Thank you. And as a final, do you have anything to add to that, Michelle? As a final
No,
speaker?
I recognize a lot, and I'll keep it short with respect to time. I recognize a lot, especially what Simon said. We're also piloting a CCB only. I think the only thing I'd like to add, it really depends from a market perspective. It's an international company, like the big palm oil producers or the Danones or the Nestle's. They have a direct impact. For a lot of companies that have a national impact, if you're a project developer in the Netherlands, for instance, you're doing construction in, I don't know, one province, then if you would also biodiversity, look locally. So
Yeah.
there's also this geographical component, I think, that where greenhouse gases is a global thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a thing I'd like to add.
Yeah, thanks. The local level of the biodiversity impact that you have, and you want to compensate it locally as well. Thank you all for that. And I would like to thank also all the participants for all their great questions and the lively chat this time. I would like to invite everybody to fill in the poll. It's a very short evaluation with a couple of questions on this webinar, what you like, whether you liked it or whether. So please fill in this poll. And at the same time, I would like to thank all the speakers again for their great effort and their inspiration on this thing. Everybody from their angle is trying to reduce the impact of climate change, reduce emissions, and create better living standards also for smallholders. And I think the lessons learned during this webinar can need to continue, and hopefully we can further develop this system to have the impact which we are all longing for, a safer and healthy planet which is equally distributing benefits. I would also like to thank all the organizers of this webinar, especially Ben Sonneveld, but also reNature and the Netherlands Enterprise Agency. As a last point, I would like to tell you that a recording of this webinar will be shared, including with the slides. If you have specific questions to the speakers, please either contact them directly or through the organizing email that was with the webinar. And then the next webinar in this series will be on monitoring and evaluation for measuring impact of interventions addressing climate change. And that will be held on the 19th of May this year. Thank you all for filling in the poll. Thank you for your attention, and I hope you have a great great day. Bye-bye.